In this video, we're going to set up our scene with some objects and entities. We'll create a floor, add a large room or a warehouse, we'll add some textures and materials, and we'll also learn a little bit about lights. So let's get started. In our last video, we covered the UI as a general overview of what are we actually looking at here in the Sumerian editor. We also added this quad. If you haven't added a quad, or you skipped the last video, or you didn't see the last video, no problem. You can always just catch up by clicking Create Entity and then adding quad. So once you do that, we'll get a quad over here. I'm going to rename it by double-clicking it in the Entities panel. I will then call it Floor. And then with it selected, I'm just going to, underneath the X rotation value, I'm going to redo the value to -90 so that it's flat and horizontal. I'm also going to select the translation values over here so I get these arrows. All right, so I have my floor. Well, it's a little bit small. And if I was to jump into VR in the scene right now, this would roughly be about 1 meter by 1 meter. We want it to be a little bit bigger than that. So under the transform component, I'm going to, under the scale, I'm going to add 100 by 100. If I zoom out, now my floor is a lot bigger. So it's really about 100 meters by 100 meters. All right, so I have a floor, but the problem is it doesn't look very good. It's just as a flat, boring gray. So let's add some materials and textures. I want to add some materials that are already available to us in the Import Assets library. So I'm going to click this button up here. And I'm going to just search for PBR. That's short for physically based rendering. Another thing you could also search for is concrete, because we're going to make a concrete floor. And this is the one I want, this PBR material pack concrete. I'm going to select that and click Add. Right away, down in the Assets panel, I'll have a brand new assets default or asset pack called the PBR material pack. And if I expand that, there are a bunch of different files in here. So we have some textures. That's really this checkered looking icon, as well as some materials, this spherical icon. I really want to work with materials and not the textures at the moment. So I'm going to filter down by just selecting the materials icon up here in the filter buttons. So I'll select that. And now I only have just materials down here in the inspector panel. Now, if I have the floor selected, I'm going to go over here to the inspector panel, expand my material component, and you see how it already has a default material. That's this basic material that was created when we added the quad. I don't want that one. I just want to replace it with a different material. So I'm going to take concrete material, concrete 7 specifically. You can choose any one you want, or you can use a totally different asset pack. You don't have to use the concrete asset pack. But then once I do that, I'm going to now have this material applied to the quad that looks like concrete. Looks realistic when I'm zoomed out, but when I zoom in, which is where I will be for the majority of this scene, it looks very pixelated and not too good. Select that back. So to change that, what I need to do, and really the reason why this is happening, is that we have essentially a 100 by 100 meter floor that takes a 1 meter by 1 meter pattern and just stretches it all the way across that entity. Instead, we want to repeat that pattern a bunch of times so that it looks a lot more realistic and not as pixelated. So it's really just zoomed in is the problem. So with my floor selected and underneath my material component, under base color, I need to edit this texture. So really, I go next to the texture, and you see how there's this little pencil icon. I'm going to select that pencil icon, which is the edit button in Sumerian. And now I can actually edit the actual texture itself. And so under repeat U, I'm going to change it to 100. And under repeat V, I'm going to add it to 100 or change it to 100. So that now, and you can see how it's kind of repeated. It looks like it's a repeating pattern. But that's also when I'm zoomed way out. When I zoom in, it's not as noticeable. It looks much more just like a concrete floor, which is exactly what we want. Perfect. That's what we need. Next, we need to create a building or a room, and we're going to do that by using a box. So I'm going to click Create Entity, and right here is the box. We'll add a box. There it is. It's being sliced in two by the floor. I'll name the box, I'll rename it room. You could call it warehouse or building, whatever makes sense. It's pretty small. Again, this is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, roughly. And I want to change it to be something more like 30 by 30. Oops, by 30. There we go. All right, so it's also kind of half underneath the floor, so I will move this up 14 units on the Y value. So now I have a box representing our room, but if I zoom in, notice that I can't see it. That's because it's only rendering from one side. Right now it's rendering from the outside in, but I want to be able to be inside the room. So I need to flip what's actually rendered from the inside out or the outside in. Under material again, I'm going to go down to culling, and the cull face is currently set to back. I instead want to make it front. So now I'm actually looking at the room or this entity from the inside out. Great. However, I don't like the color. The color is kind of, again, this boring gray. So I'm going to, under the material component and then color diffuse, I'm going to select this color picker and I'm going to go to something more like that. Lastly, I want to add a logo to the middle of my room to add some branding. So what I'm going to do is click Create Entity again, select the quad again, and I'm going to rename this quad sign. If you can't see it, that's probably because, it is rendered, we're on the other side of it. Remember, it's only renders by default on one side, so we got to move the camera around to see it. I'm going to use these gizmos to place it close on the wall. And I'll change the transform to something like 16 by 9. So that it is generally about the ratio of a TV or a TV monitor. Right. Again, it is this kind of the boring gray. So we want to add a texture that is a unique texture that I'm going to pull directly off of my machine. I'm just going to use a Sumerian logo image. So I'm going to select the browser button, which it looks like a folder, and I'm going to find this Sumerian.png. And there we go. Now I've added some custom branding to my scene and learned how to add a texture. The last thing I want to cover is lights, and so let's click on Create Entity, and notice there are 3 different light types. You see there's, oops, I didn't mean to do that. There's point, directional, and spot. Let's first cover directional, because if under my default dynamic lights, I have 2 directional lights, key and rim, and if I select those, you notice how it has a direction. It's kind of pointing from one direction, the other one's pointing from the other direction. And what a directional light is, it's really meant to mimic a light source that's infinitely far away, something like the sun. So where its actual position or its translation value within the scene doesn't matter, just the rotation will actually make a difference. So as I select my rotation value, rotation gizmos up here, and as I move it, you see how the lighting is changing based on my rotation. But if I was to position it differently or change the translation values, it wouldn't have an effect because it's just the direction that matters. Let's now look at what a point light is. I'm going to click point light. The point light acts most like a light bulb, so it emits light in a spherical fashion. So if I zoom out, you can really see how far the light reaches. I'll zoom back in. And it starts off by being in the middle, and the translation of this type of light does matter. So as I move it around, you'll see how it gets brighter when it gets closer to the wall. And we'll raise it up here. We'll leave this light in here for now until we can make some adjustments later if we want. But it adds just a little bit more light into our scene. The last light we can cover is the spotlight. If I click on the spotlight, this really does act like a spotlight or a flashlight. And it has a cone-shaped light emission. So if you want to mimic a spotlight, or headlights or something like that, that's what those would be for. I'm going to go ahead and delete this light 2 that I just created. And this other light, which is the point light, I'm going to go ahead and just drag and drop that into the default dynamic lights. So all my lights are grouped together. I hope you join us in the next video where we will look at how to import objects and assets from the import assets library. We'll be using the centrifugal pump as really the main source and the main model and the main asset within the rest of this scene. So I hope you join us. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments of this video. If you haven't already, please join also our Sumerian community on Slack at slack.sumerian.world.